Hey guys, this is Sean Kiernan with We For Warriors.
What I'm saying is PTSD is not like a one-time thing. It's a series of events that over time cause exposure to areas of the brain that shut down. My primary mission is to spread awareness about ayahuasca. Back in 2014, I led a group of treatment-resistant vets to the Amazon. What we struggle with in combat or at home is a spiritual crisis. I treat PTSD as a spiritual crisis, but I know that I am a spirit. I know that I am something greater than myself.
Hey guys, this is Sean Kiernan with We For Warriors, and I'm here today with Ryan LeCompte, a Marine out of Colorado who I'm good friends with. So Ryan, introduce yourself and kind of what you're up to and your background as a veteran.
Hey Sean, thanks for having me on. My name is Ryan LeCompte. I'm a former United States Marine. I served on active duty and honorably discharged from 2007 to 2011 as an 0311 infantryman. I'm a proud father of two boys, ages 5 and 3. So people know me as a veteran, but the most important people know me as a dad. I hold a BA in psychology from the Athens State University in Alabama, and I'm currently in my third year for my master's program in transpersonal counseling psychology at Naropa University to become a psychotherapist. And I work with a self-developed Western trauma-informed shamanic model with a driving focus in Gestalt, somatic, and Jungian approaches to trauma and addictions. I also am the founder of Veterans for Entheogenic Therapy, or VET. It's a Colorado nonprofit organization whose primary mission is to spread awareness about alternative medicines for the treatment of treatment-resistant chronic PTSD in veterans. I also organize trips to South America, to the Amazon and Peru with veterans who have been diagnosed by the VA with treatment-resistant PTSD and or addiction, to work with Shipibo shamans and curanderos, working with ayahuasca for healing.
Wow. You've done a lot more than I think most, and so I look forward to this conversation. But first, the most important question, are you an Alabama University fan?
Hell no, man. I am by way of Alabama. I am a Southern boy, though. I grew up in Louisiana. I'm a raging Cajun, coon ass. So I am a Who Dat New Orleans Saints fan, and I am for the LSU Tigers. You know, my mom's generation, and when I was a kid, we used to wear bags over our heads at Saints games because of how bad the Saints were. And I was actually on active duty when the Saints won the Super Bowl, their first Super Bowl ring against the Indianapolis Colts. And I got to admit, I cried like a baby, man, because New Orleans is my hometown. It's a big melting pot of every race, gender, creed, nationality, and it's got a special place in my heart for sure.
You joined the Marine Corps in 2007. You spent 4 years. You were honorably discharged. How many tours overseas did you do while in the Marine Corps?
I was actually when I went through School of Infantry at Camp Geiger, North Carolina. I was slated to attach to 1-6, who was deployed to Afghanistan. And we had a recruiter come in from 8th and I, Marine Barracks, Washington, who was a pallbearer. He was a body bearer, one of 8 Marines in the entire Marine Corps that was hand-selected to carry caskets at Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia. And so I went through their strength training tests. I went through there were so many tests that they put me through at that point, measured my jawline, just crazy standards and screening processes. And I passed that, and I was selected to go to D.C. to carry caskets at Arlington. I did that along with providing White House security at the White House, working with Secret Service, UD, and Homeland, as well as working at the Pentagon. And I did that for 4 years until the end of my enlistment came in 2011. A lot of guys that I was slated to go with to Afghanistan in 1-6, I had lost and buried, that I went through infantry training battalion with. So that's sort of that's my background with the Marine Corps. I'm also a military brat. My dad served in the first Gulf War, and he did 20 years in the military. And his father, who's my grandfather, served at the Battle of Iwo Jima as a Marine, and he was 16 years old in that battle.
So let's see. So you basically were a pallbearer for a good part of your career during the wars. I mean, how does that feel to constantly be, I can remember one thing that sticks with me, and I buried two people in my company, both of my platoon, or one in my platoon, one in my company, the 21 gun salute, and the tap. Yeah. When I hear it, it kind of brings me right back. I mean, how does that affect someone to be around that on a daily basis or weekly basis?
Yeah, I mean, it was difficult. The motto that we had was the last to let you down. That was the Marine Corps motto for the body bearers. And it's difficult folding that flag and handing it to family members who are just in tears, and you feel their grief, but you just, with a straight face, doing that over and over for so long. I'm guessing it's played its part in my own relationship to the military and the sacrifices. I actually buried a few guys that I went through ITB with, and the one that hit closest to home was a friend who had killed himself in the barracks that lived a door down from me, who had just gotten back from Iraq, who was also a fellow 0311 infantry guy, and we'd found him the morning of, and he had hanged himself in his barracks, and that really stirred things up for me. Early on in my career, in 2008, we lost Sergeant Leon, and yeah, man, I can still remember. I can say the creed back to you that we say to the family members who we hand flags to. I'll never forget it. It's, "Sir, ma'am, on behalf of the President of the United States Marine Corps and all Marines, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved ones' faithful and dedicated service to our country and to our Corps." And then I would salute and about face and follow my fire team. So it was difficult, man. I mean, and that's partly what plays into my awareness moving forward in research and moving forward with treatment of vets and all of the time I spent at the VA after I got out in 2011, going through the VA's process of being prescribed all these different medications, the cocktail of disaster, man. I mean, I went through all that shit, and then I got off it after listening to vet stories and spending 8-10 hour days at the Birmingham VA, just researching through my undergrad, doing a capstone project on treatment resistance and why PTSD there's so much resistance to treatment with it. And that's been my path so far, leading up to where I'm at now. It's really been the eye opener for me as a veteran and as someone who does want to continue serving my brothers and sisters,
Yeah, so let's talk about that. The organization that you started, why you started it, and kind of what it focuses on.
Absolutely. So after I got off all those medications, I was prescribed Prozac for depression because, like the American Psychological Association has declared that there are 3 primary approaches to treating PTSD: psychotherapy, psychopharmacology, and resourcing and education. I had no issue with the psychotherapy, although some of those modalities there were limited. CBT, exposure therapy could definitely re-trigger or re-traumatize vets. So that was a very specific use or modality of treating PTSD, and oftentimes, again, without pharmaceutical interventions, could cause a swelling of PTSD, so to speak. So being offered that in or out of the VA, it was the pharmaceutical interventions that I saw that had an issue. The FDA approved drugs for treating PTSD were antidepressants for depression, sedating anxiolytics or benzodiazepines for anxiety, and barbiturates for sleeping. Mainly those are the 3 different approaches to treating PTSD. It's anxiety, depression, and sleeping patterns that they I guess the way to explain it is like PTSD is at the top of this umbrella, and underneath are these three different symptoms of PTSD. And so the VA and Western medicine focuses more on treating the symptoms of PTSD. It's a form of treatment called allopathic, and that means treating symptoms as a means to find a cure. And so Western medicine, in some cases, can be really useful for mental health. I know people who suffer from dissociative disorders that really do need some of those pharmaceutical interventions. So I can see the need for it in certain contexts. I can even see the need for antidepressants, short-term use only. And as long as that's being used short-term along with therapy, it could be very beneficial. But for a very specific population of PTSD patients, specifically chronic and treatment resistant, man, antidepressants, diagnosing and prescribing veterans to be on these medications long term and not following up with effective psychotherapy, it can be devastating. And I feel like that, although I don't see any science out there right now to suggest that PTSD is a correlational factor to see the rise in suicide rates amongst vets, but I feel like that could be a definite. I'd be surprised to see the correlation between those two.
I have a question, so let me interrupt you, and I apologize about this because you're really touching on a lot of really good topics. And, I want to get into what you're doing to address the issue you're talking about. Because you're doing something really interesting, and you're, I think, at the forefront of some really interesting solutions for veterans. But before we get in there, is the suicide causation not PTSD, but Western medicine's solution to PTSD, that the tail ends, we know these medicine thoughts, and they talk about suicide as a side effect. So should it be any surprise that when we medicate a huge population like veterans coming back, that we have this suicide issue?
Oh, dude, that would be another strong correlation. And I use the word correlation because I'm not using causation when I say that, because it's really hard with PTSD and so many different strings being pulled underneath and the crisis of consciousness itself. I can't really nail down, although there's strong evidence to say that, a lot of PTSD is rooted in childhood trauma. But I feel like those medications could definitely speeden up the suicide rate, if that makes sense. It could exacerbate symptoms more so than help them. Well,
they're a trigger, right? And we measure
definitely
based on, the bell curve, right? So if you have such a large population that doesn't show these side effects and a small population that does, and these are accepted solutions, and you give them to 100,000 people and 1% have suicidal thoughts, that's 1,000 people that are going to feel like they want to commit suicide.
Which is a lot. I mean, in the grand scheme, that sample size is huge. And that's why I feel like even the work that I do with vet and cannabis, these things may not be for everybody. There are vets who come back and have a structured support system that, family and friends, and it could be a number of factors. It could be a shitty support structure coming back, and that could be rooted in childhood. That could be indicative of not having enough support growing up as a kid. Or it could be the fact that they, fucking had to kill a little kid over there because it compromised the safety of their entire platoon on a convoy run. I mean, it could be. What I'm saying is PTSD is not like a one-time thing. It's a series of events that over time cause exposure to areas of the brain that shut down and allow for the people to have a set of resiliency skills that could help them cope in healthy ways to deal with stuff. And for me, marijuana is one way of helping people cope that's so much better than shitty pharmaceutical bullshit drugs that can just make a person go nuts.
Okay. Yeah. So marijuana, and obviously that's, I'm focused on that, and I know you've been focused on it. You've helped a tremendous amount in that cause. And I can't even pronounce that middle name, but please do, VET. Explain that to the people listening what it is and the substance we're talking about?
Oh, you bet, man. So what I sort of, I guess my area of expertise, if you want to call it that, my SHME area is Veterans for Entheogenic Therapy. And the word entheogenic means divine within. So it's taking a form of psychotherapy that involves a component of spirituality, which I feel like a lot of what we struggle with in combat or at home is a spiritual crisis. I treat PTSD as a spiritual crisis. And so what I do is my primary mission is to spread awareness about ayahuasca in particular is one of those modalities. We do support peyote use in ceremony with Native Americans. But what these substances do is show you that you have something within yourself that is capable of finding healthy coping styles and healthy ways of navigating in the world with your PTSD. And there are actual there's fMRI brain scans recently that have been published in Brazil and I think in Spain that show areas of the brain that ayahuasca actually targets, and that those same areas of the brain, ironically enough, have been affected by PTSD. The limbic system, the parasympathetic system, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the meaning-making part of the brain. So now there's some physical stuff coming out about ayahuasca, but really what it comes down to is getting back to the root of who we are as human beings and finding a sense of empowerment as veterans who've been stigmatized for centuries now.
What is ayahuasca?
So ayahuasca is a shamanic brew. It's been developed over the course of the last 2,000, 3,000 years. That's what's been known to Western society as a psychoactive brew that shamans who are called spiritual ayahuasqueros, I guess the best word to describe a shaman is someone who's been selected out of their tribe to drink this medicine and to navigate, the spiritual realm and to bring back sources of information for the tribe, for the benefit of the tribe. And so, you access different parts of who you are. It's hard to really get into unless you've gone there. I'm sure there's listeners out there who have gone there, but for those who have never tried ayahuasca, it's a divine experience. It's a spiritual experience.
When we talk about ayahuasca, because there's ayahuasca, ibogaine, I believe, and then there's peyote. And to a lot of people, they confuse it and think it's the same thing, and it's not. I mean,
right.
Cactus, and used by native. And again, I by no means am an expert in this, so please excuse me if I stick my foot in my mouth. But peyote is a cactus used by Native Americans in North America. Ayahuasca is used. Where is it predominantly from? Where has it been used? And what is it physically?
Gotcha. So yeah, ayahuasca is a South American brew, mainly originated in Peru, northern Peru, in the Amazon, and it has two active ingredients in it. The first is caapi leaf. It's called CAAPI. It's caapi, Banisteris caapi, and that holds the MAOI inhibitor, which allows the other ingredient, which is the vine, the ability to sit in your gut and allow your metabolism to process the active ingredient, which is dimethyltryptamine or DMT. There's been a documentary called DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and it's a profound substance. It's something that's new in the West, but it's been around in the Amazon for thousands of years. People often attribute it to dreams, like that's the reason we have dreams. And so your brain actually produces small amounts of it while you sleep, and when you die, your body produces massive amounts of it. So it suggests that, it's the first time in history that the West has really looked at a molecule that, or a receptor in the brain that works with the serotonergic system that says okay, I have a spirit, or in a sense, I am not, my body is a carrier of my spirit and my soul. And people, I mean, I believe it. I'm a believer in what it is and how it works. I just can't explain exactly why. But I know that I am a spirit. I know that I am something greater than myself.
About that right there. You can explain why, but that doesn't mean you're not trying to explain why. You've been involved, with many groups that are looking to do studies into ayahuasca. You're looking into, you do work some groups in the U.S. that have I don't know if they've administered or not, but look to administer it. You've been actively involved in the movement. You've been actively involved in groups that are helping. You've gone with veterans to Peru, I believe, or Florida. What you've done in the past 12 to 20, 18 months to advance the cause, because we now understand who you are. We also have a limited understanding of what ayahuasca is for the listener. Now to lead us through kind of what your journey is to, like Weed for Warriors is for cannabis, your group is for ayahuasca, and connecting veterans who are interested with that alternative medicine beyond your personal journey of your education and getting your master's, your third year of your master's, and your BA in psychology in Alabama, where it is you currently are and where your efforts are right now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I didn't mention this before, but back in 2014, I led a group of treatment-resistant vets to the Amazon, and was followed by the CNN reporter Lisa Ling, and we were featured in a documentary that aired on public television called This Is Life with Lisa Ling. And so really since that excursion to the jungle, I have been collecting informal data using psychometrics that measure the severity, specifically CAPS, and post-traumatic growth inventory is another one I'm using to measure potential growth from interventions like ayahuasca and what's been used in the past as a tool to measure changes in PTSD severity. And so I was convinced by the results of that informal data just from a few vets that were considered anecdotal. So I took that data to several research organizations that potentially would sponsor a study that I would push through my graduate institution at Naropa University's IRB, and the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies was the one that seemed to support this work the most, so I went with them.
Okay, so MAPS,
right?
Yeah, everyone knows Rick Doblin, and Rick Doblin fame. He's been around forever, and he's advanced the study with Sue Sisley, who I was not involved with, but how I came up through and got involved with this, and you then approached him. So explain to us, your involvement with MAPS initially and kind of how that started.
Well, for my capstone, for my bachelor's degree, as a side project, I wrote a proposal called LSD assisted psychotherapy for alcoholism. And I did a bunch of digging back in the 50s where they showed some promise in working with LSD for patients suffering from alcoholism, severe alcoholism. And there was some promise there. So I wanted to do a follow-up on that. And so I submitted that protocol to MAPS and Rick Doblin and asked that they provide financial support to conduct that study through my graduate program. Now, I initially wanted to do that and pulled out of that and really did some more digging with ayahuasca and found more of my veteran identity to be an immediate need that I needed to address, both as a veteran and as a researcher, considering the suicide rate. So I went that direction and sort of changed my protocol around to name it ayahuasca-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant chronic PTSD in veterans. And I am the principal investigator on that study. So I pitched that to MAPS. I worked extensively with other names in the field like Dr. Gabor Mate, Dr. Stan Groff, Dr. Charles Grobe, and Dr. Roland Griffiths, and Dr. Dennis McKenna, all of which are part of different research organizations, and had the support of these guys and submitted my protocol after I got out here to Naropa for review. That process took longer than I had expected due to the illicit nature of ayahuasca, it being a Schedule I substance. It took a lot of grounding and pounding and educating the institutional review board at Naropa to get their approval on this study. But it was showing promise. So on one side, I was educating the board about what ayahuasca is, answering any questions, safety concerns that they had about this exposed population. But no real resistance, just a lot of digging and researching and follow-ups with board members. And I learned a lot in that process as a researcher, like how long it really does take to get a study through involving a Schedule I substance. But during that time, I'm sharing data with MAPS, and I had their support with their clinical team out there at Santa Barbara or Santa Cruz, California. And Rick himself was just an amazing ally in getting this study pushed through. I'd come to him with concerns about the IRB's process. I wasn't, as a veteran, wasn't really familiar. I was putting both feet forward doing this for the need of vets. So I continued using them as a consulting agent as well as a financial sponsor.
Let me interrupt you and let's take a break, okay?
And we'll be right back after these 5 dabs.
There was an NPR interview today where they talk about sympathy fatigue. What is a real issue, or is this not a real issue?
No, dude, this is absolutely a real issue. One of the things that we do at Naropa as training clinicians is to practice self-care to combat, burnout or sympathy fatigue. And I can connect with what sympathy fatigue is for me. I've experienced it, which has been an indicator for me to sort of what I call take Shabbos, or shut down all electronics, be with my family, do what I need to do, exercise, meditate. There's so many tools that are available that I can use as a practitioner to combat this sympathy fatigue. And at the same time, it can be used as a red card, especially dealing with the population like veterans. Addicts is another population that practitioners and researchers like to pull out that card for. And it's basically finger pointing at a specific population to say, well, they're treatment resistant because they're unwilling to comply with therapy. And I have to call that out and say that that's complete bullshit. I've met vets who have been completely willing on every level to show up for therapy and show up for the treatment. And still, I've lost a few, and I've come damn near close to talking a few down from suicide, who have on every level have shown heart and a willingness to be open for help. So yeah, I see both sides, but I feel like this goes into the stigma of veterans and research. And, Yogi Berra once said that, the difference between theory and practice, there is no difference, but in practice there is. And I feel like when you're dealing with researchers who are in theory looking at something to treat it, they're not practicing in the field. They don't see on ground level what patients are going through. And for me, that divide came very strongly and clearly in the research I was doing with MAPS.
It would be fair to say you've had a falling out with MAPS, and it would be fair to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, it would be fair to say that you are no longer doing any research with them, and it would be fair to say that other researchers came on board and seemed to have been a catalyst for this. And correct me if any of that is wrong.
So I pitch budget proposals to MAPS a month before that, several months before that, gathering information about how much it's going to cost to ship veterans to Peru, how many veterans we're going to be working with over the course of a year. I mean, the devil is in the details in my protocol, which has been shared with every single member of MAPS openly. And so while sharing that, I divulged a lot of data to them and specifics on how this study would be carried out. And that's leading up to introducing a fellow researcher as a co-investigator, Dr. Jessica Nielsen out of UCSF in California, who had did some work with PTSD and ayahuasca prior to me submitting this protocol. And so from that, I developed and created my own protocol and submitted that to MAPS, inviting Jessica on as a co-investigator, who has been a great ally in helping me revamp the protocol and getting it submitted to the IRB. She's very research driven, and she has done a lot of research on spinal cord injuries. Very, very prestigious and amazing researcher. So that's leading up to the month before the chaos ensued.
Okay, so right now you have been working with MAPS for how long? At this point in time, when you're a month before things went south.
It would be since 2013.
So you've been working with MAPS and Rick Doblin for 3 years.
Plus 3 years, yeah.
Okay. And at this point in time, you've got your BA, you're finishing your master's, you've been doing you've done a ton of ground. As I say, you're in the trench, right? You're not back at the Pentagon. You are dealing daily with veterans and people who have real issues. And so your real life experience is unbelievable. And now your academic experience is catching up in terms of not only do you have the plaques on the walls you need, but in that sense, you're actually doing real research and helping people research this issue. And what you do is an observational study, correct?
Right. Yeah. So this would be a non-interventional observational study.
Okay, perfect. And it was set up to fly veterans, because there's going to be veterans, if I'm not mistaken, down to Peru to take ayahuasca and then return to the U.S., correct?
Right, and go through an integrative year-long process that I felt was needed after the first time we went to Peru in 2014. A lot of the vets that came back were like, "Hey, Ryan, I got this great experience. I feel like PTSD while I was there was manageable. I found an inner strength that I never felt before in my entire life. But I'm having trouble integrating this into my daily life." And so I drew inspiration from that and came out to Naropa to study transpersonal psychology, which is spiritual in nature, and start gathering tools for these vets as they return back. I had a year-long integration program developed and created that was part of the protocol.
Okay. So how long would you say time frame you were working on this study? Meaning the stuff you're presenting to MAPS in terms of you're bearing all the MAPS. How long had you been working on this, and for how long have you been working with MAPS on this? Is this something that you've been working with them for 3 years, but was it 3 years of this stuff, or was it a 6 months of this stuff and 2.5 years of other stuff? And I don't know if that's a really amateurish way of saying it, but I'm just trying to figure out to dissect it to give people a picture.
No, so the actual study I started with MAPS as an informal study, as a preliminary study, was back in 2014 when I took the vets to Peru and CNN had came with us. That study was sponsored by MAPS. MAPS actually paid for 2 of the veterans' flight and retreat costs.
Okay. So it would be fair to say that you and MAPS have been a partner in this topic, in this everything building up to this study was for this study since 2014, so 2+ years.
2+ years. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you're telling me you bought Jessica from UCSF into this, not Rick?
Not Rick.
So did you bring Jessica into this study, meaning introduce him to Rick and MAPS?
No. So Jessica and another researcher named Julie Megler, was a nurse practitioner. They did a preliminary mining of the potential for ayahuasca for PTSD, and that was, I believe, back in 2012. It was an article, a research article published by MAPS that was released back in 2012 or 2013, that gave about 3 or 4 paragraphs about the potentiality of ayahuasca for PTSD. And so from that inspiration, I created a full-length, full-size protocol for ayahuasca for PTSD in U.S. veterans. And so from that inspiration, I offered Jessica to come on as a co-investigator to honor that early article that she had published with MAPS.
Okay, perfect. So now, but Rick introduced you to then?
No.
Oh, you met her outside of MAPS then?
I introduced Jessica. Jessica had not, since she had released that article, she and Julie had a falling out, and so they went their separate ways, and nobody was doing any research on ayahuasca for a number of years. And so as I got my inspiration through my own use of ayahuasca, I submitted the protocol to MAPS and eventually asked Jessica to come on board, introducing her to Rick.
Okay, so you introduced her to Rick. Okay.
As a principal investigator, I introduced Jessica to Rick and said, I'm taking on Jessica as a co-investigator.
And this was 2016?
This was, so that was this year, early this year.
Okay, so it's the winter of 2016. Now, Rick didn't know her before this, or was he aware of her?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Rick, MAPS is what helped publish that article.
Okay, that's what I wanted, because I heard that earlier. I wanted to make sure. So he's aware that you guys are talking at this level, and you come to Rick and say, I'd like to bring Jessica on board and be a co-investigator at this point in 2016.
Right.
Okay. So things look great here. I mean, Rick is positive. Jessica's positive. Ryan's positive. You guys are doing great stuff. I've seen you. I've been following you. I've been one of your biggest fans. What the hell has gone wrong here? What's gone wrong from your perspective? Obviously, there's different perspectives, but I want to hear your perspective, because that's what this is why we're talking. I want to get your perspective.
Right. So a couple months ago, Bia Labate, who is an anthropologist who had been working with ayahuasca for a couple decades, she definitely has prestige in her field working with ayahuasca, but has very little to no experience with mental health. She had come on board, and Rick was the one that invited her due to an article that she published earlier this year about veterans and PTSD. So in that article, Bia addressed a lot of her own, what she perceived to be a veteran image. She got a basic veteran image and understanding an idea about what it means to be a veteran through mass media. So she had watched Rambo. That's what she believed vets to be: warmongering, just crazy alpha narcissistic males. And so she did some experiencing with vets, and there seemed to be some potential opening there about her understanding of vets. So Rick brought her on, and onto the chain of emails for the research team for the ayahuasca study. And, we're working together. I wasn't against Bia. I followed her work, and I supported what she was doing as a supporter of ayahuasca on the grounds of that. I mean, I felt like that was enough, given the stigma of the scheduling of ayahuasca. But then early on in the conversations, she had been spouting off, a lot of anti-military, anti-veteran, it was her bias, and I intervened and said, look, here's my bias. I'm a United States Marine. I have a bias toward green people that is very close to my heart. It's in my blood, and this is offensive the way you're talking about veterans. And so Rick actually followed up with that email and addressed it as well and said, Bia, I don't feel like we need to get rid of the military. We definitely need the military.
So wait, let me follow because I'm not following here. So Rick brings in Bia, who's an anthropologist from Brazil.
Yeah.
And she lives in Brazil based on her experience with ayahuasca, which my understanding is her own personal experience because she had some own issues that she's used ayahuasca to heal. Would that be fair to say?
Right. Yeah. She had some trauma and loss.
Okay. So much like you, she comes from it, from using it to see her healing, and she's seen other people heal. Would it be fair to say you guys have similar kind of approaches to this and very different from Jessica, who's a pure clinical researcher. And I don't even know if that's the right word, but I'll say it. She comes at it from a very much more non-numbers perspective. She's been through it. She's been through the trauma. She's been through the healing. She's been through the use of ayahuasca. She's an anthropologist. Many, like some of our friends, are anthropologists who are very interested in this from a cultural perspective. She's invited by Rick. And so what I'm hearing from you is you're attributing kind of the downfall at MAPS to the adding of Bia to this team.
Well, yeah, in a sense, I mean, ethically, like you were saying earlier, ethically, I think the divide came for me, or the stepping out of came for me, when they decided to kick me off of the study. Yeah, I feel like Bia and I come from different backgrounds, and
it sounds like you felt stigmatized by Bia for being a veteran, and therefore what ends up happening is, in one sense, you're marginalized. You're marginalized on the team, which ends up for you stepping down from the very study you kind of started pushing for. Bia comes on. She's, from your perception, confrontational with you based on your background as a military veteran.
Right. Not even as a researcher. I mean, we had very few, we haven't even talked about research up to that point. It was mainly me naming my bias as a veteran and defending vets, and aside from even my identity as a vet, as a researcher, ethically working with this population.
Correct. But why is vets even, I mean, the outsiders go, okay, why are vets even involved at this point in time, other than maybe her personal attack against you? But what I'm trying to understand is there seems to be a timeline here. So she's introduced to the study.
Right.
She's confrontational on emails to you.
Right away.
Right away, you don't know why.
Right.
You figure out it's because it's perception of the veteran, right? And this is a study you're advancing for veterans. Is she advocating not making the study about veterans anymore?
I don't know Bia's approach. I'm starting to figure that out. It took me a while, man, through these emails to really figure out, like, is she here to help this study go through, or is she trying to push her own agenda or push her own bias into this? I couldn't figure it out. I mean, she's obviously in the academic world, so is she here to help, or is she here to talk shit about the population we'd be working with? And that was the grounds for me to step up and say, not only as a veteran, but as a researcher, to say, dude, the world that I come from in mental health is like, the utmost respect and commitment to the betterment of the population you're working with as a practicing clinician, man. You can't fucking talk shit about people that you're going to be working with unless you're sitting behind a desk. And that's
what did she specifically say about you that you knew of at the time? And I think you become aware of other things she said post-fact, but at the time you're talking about how you had to stand up against her and her perceived bias. So explain to me what she said that made you stand up for veterans.
Well, sort of, she brought in the political the political side of the U.S.'s involvement in South America and in the Middle East. And, I've gotten in this discussion with a lot of researchers in the field and civilians, alike, all of them, and fellow vets who've been like, yeah, dude, there's some really nasty, shitty things going on as far as the political involvement is concerned. So I stood up for the fact that we're not here to talk about politics. We're here to talk about healing an exposed population.
Got it.
And that's really, that's been my ethos moving forward in this work is, yeah, I can do activism. I can push advocacy for the war, but that's not where I want to focus. I want to focus on healing my brothers and sisters who made a sacrifice regardless of what it was for. They wrote a blank check to Uncle Sam.
You basically perceive she's wanting to attack veterans based on specific U.S. veterans, based on U.S. foreign policy issues, her being in Brazil. She wants to attack that versus where you just are looking at the study and the veterans being, sick, and she wants to talk about. Now, was she justifying it that screw the vets, I don't care about them because of what they did, or was it more subtle and then lead into where the differences started to come up with regards to you and everyone else on the research team?
Gotcha. So yeah, as a researcher, I felt like, working with this population, it's important to keep the politics out. So I stuck with that. And then I also addressed, her concern about if ayahuasca is administered to veterans, how do we know these vets aren't going to go back out there and kill more babies? I mean, that's in a nutshell what her argument was that stemmed from the political, foreign policy issues.
So she said that. Now, let me get this straight. So is she advocating at this point in time to not focus on vets, or just is she ranting about vets?
No, it didn't seem like she was saying let's not focus on vets. She was just pushing her own bias and not checking it. She wasn't being academic in the sense that a researcher's called to duty to make sure that our bias are kept out of research, to conduct real scientific inquiry.
Okay. So you had a concern based on her expressed views and how she was talking about veterans, whether or not she could check her bias.
Right. And it wasn't that she had a bias, Sean. It was the fact that it was unchecked. It was the fact that it wasn't being owned. Now, I came forth after I defended vets and said, look, here's my unchecked bias. I'm going to check it right now for you and tell you that as a veteran, this is what my perspective is as a researcher and how that might affect my view in this research. And that was not being sent back. There was no pinging back and saying, okay, well, here's my bias. I grew up in Brazil. I have a sour taste in my mouth about the U.S. I've been involved in activism for over 40 years now. And, it may have been something as simple as, Contra killed my brother who was involved in U.S. It could be I don't know what it was that was sparking her bias against the United States and veterans. But this goes back to the stigma against veterans and why we're struck with this viewpoint of like baby killers, warmongers, alpha crazy, greased up, crazy dudes that want to just fucking rape and pillage every country.
So, well, and you see it here in the U.S. I mean, even after the shooters in Dallas and other places, it's immediately always a veteran. And
right.
What they point out is the eight people killed were veterans too. And right. So to talk about that is, you come from this. Is this stigmatization of veterans real, and what's the dangers of it as you see it from an...
Absolutely. Yes. Fuck yes, it's real. And the dangers are that if we mistreat, how are we going to treat veterans moving forward? Are we going to treat them the way we see it on the media, the way we see it for ourselves in a sort of bubbled, privileged society? Are we going to label them the way we want to see them, which can lead to burnout? Or are we going to work with understanding and trying to help a population who are suffering from a debilitating mental illness? And I could consider PTSD not a mental illness. It's something that has been long overdue through the course of many decades, with a lot of us struggling with this. Is, dude, we're patients. We're not something that physicians, practitioners, researchers, presidents, congressmen, senators, anyone can point their finger at and dishonor our service for. I mean, that's a separate issue that needs to be, that needs, in the politics of it, need to be kept out of administering treatment for a population of patients.
I agree with you. So we're talking about the stigmatization. It is real. I would agree with you. It's real. I see it, and it scares me. It scares me because privilege allows you to overcome stigma. Very few of our enlisted brothers and sisters come from privilege or have the money to be called privileged. So they're really given these second-rate treatments and second-rate, to send them to these wars and cause these issues to begin with. So
you got it.
Let's go back to, at this time, you're unaware of this email. I'm going to read you an email that I'm in possession of, and I'll post it if need be, if anyone wants to see it. But it's an email, an internal email between Bia, Jessica, Rick, and a few other researchers. And let me read to you what it is. And this is why, obviously, is going on with you. And you're kind of having this discussion with Bia, and you're unaware of this email that I'm about to read. I'm going to read this email. I want to get your immediate visceral reaction. So here it goes. So this is from Bia to Rick. Rick, congratulations on your patience and efforts. We scheduled a meeting to discuss the protocol request to join the meeting. That was canceled. That was when we canceled the meeting. So you were bringing some gentleman from Soul Quest, and we don't have to talk. We can talk about that if you want. But they canceled it because you were bringing someone from Soul Quest. The Dama Church, Daime, I don't even know how you pronounce that. How do you pronounce it? Daime Church. Okay, the Daime Church we consulted was a different one than the one he consulted, he being yourself. So he is wrong about that too. They were in favor, but lacked personnel, and we didn't want to work with the church in Oregon. So all that stuff I know nothing about, and you can add color about, but that's not what got me interested in this story. I'm about to tell you what the sentence after this is what got me into the story. Now remember, listeners, this is an email from a PhD on a research project who is an anthropologist, not a psychologist or psychiatrist, emailing another gentleman, Rick Doblin, who's very well known, and by all my encounters is a wonderful gentleman, who's also have his degree in public policy. And they're talking about a veteran community and Ryan specifically. And this is Ryan, who you've listened to now for a while. You make the judgment if you think this fits his description. Again, here I go. He disagrees on what I said, but I did not say anything to him. He is interpreting what Jessica told him, so he can't disagree on what I said because I never spoke to him. Now, in all caps and in bold, I am sorry this all happened. I sent and advised since the beginning, since the start, this guy, meaning you, had serious mental problems. Best, Bia. Let me read that sentence again. I am sorry this all happened. I sent and advised since the beginning this guy had serious mental problems. This is a PhD bought into a study, an anthropologist, talking to MAPS head Rick Doblin, who has his PhD in public policy, about you, Ryan LeCompte, who've been with him for 3.5 years, saying you have mental illness. What's your reaction?
Oh, man. Yeah, it's just amazing. It's amazing that conclusion was brought upon after the countless efforts and emails that I've had between every one of them to work with them and be willing to do this work. I mean, it goes back to the stigma. It goes back to writing someone off and pulling out the card when they have a voice about their own study, or, you know, if this is happening to me, it concerns me about the population that MAPS will be working with moving forward. So for the past 2 years, I've been scouting, on top of doing this research, I've been scouting site locations for the study. The first one I went to, obviously in Peru, was a potential. Scouting that out, I felt comfortable with the shamans there, that they had the right attitude and approach to treating vets with PTSD. Rick early on had been against that, advised against that due to, you know, how much it would cost vets to go down there. He didn't want to shuffle out the money to pay for vets to go down.
Which we all have budgets. Right,
absolutely. And so I was willing to work with him in the U.S. and find a potential site here. So I came across the Santo Daime Church in Oregon, working with a guy named Jonathan Goldman, who was a great guy. Flew out to his location in Ashland, Oregon, did a weekend workshop with him and his organization, the Church of Our Lady. And this is where therapy and religion can sort of bash together, bash heads. In doing that work, as I believe as a researcher and as a practitioner, you should be drinking the medicine that you're going to be, you know, asking your population to be working with. And we can talk about that in regards to the VA and why the burnout happens. But I feel like doctors should be taking the medicine that they're prescribing. So that's why I go out here and I do this work with sites to make sure that they have all of what I feel is needed for vets to make a recovery. Did a weekend workshop with them, did not fit what I felt was appropriate for vets, especially certain aspects of their ceremonial process and ritual, bowing to altars, wearing all white, dancing in circles for 8 hours.
Very religious approach that some vets, just like the 12-step program, they don't want to do because it has a spiritual part. You're more from you kind of shy away from that because you know as well as I, vets aren't going to be into that.
Right, and not only that, but physically, like some vets that I have on the study are missing limbs. Like they can't stand up. They're Purple Heart recipients. They can't stand up and sit down and move around and sing and dance and do all these things. And so that wasn't an issue to raise those concerns with John Goldman. I was like, dude, I really appreciate being a traveler in your world and experiencing what you do. However, this doesn't seem to be fitting the kind of set and setting that we need. Would you be willing to change some aspects of the ceremony to make it so more so for people to really just delve into their own work, and you guys sort of act as a spiritual crisis team? And that wasn't received, and he disagreed and said he wasn't willing to change it. So I was like, all right, good to go. And we had a nice talk to the airport, and we were like, John, thanks for having me out here. And you know, I flew back to Colorado and reported back into MAPS and the IRB and said I'm still scouting out a site right now. Peru was still out of the bag at that point.
I mean, you're trying to find a legit – how many people in the U.S. are actually administering ayahuasca legally? And how are they doing that legally since it's Schedule 1?
Legally right now, only 2 churches have – there are a lot of churches that actually have the religious freedoms needed to practice with ayahuasca as a sacrament, part of their church under the Religious Freedoms Act. 2, however, the DEA has moved ayahuasca specifically into an exemption status, which means that you as a church with your religious freedoms and your bylaws and your paperwork and your training from wherever the traditions come from. So if you, like, say you wanted to train to become an ayahuasquero, to practice with ayahuasca, you would have to go to Brazil or Peru and do an 8 to 16 week course, drinking 2 to 3 times a day with a what's considered by their government to be an ayahuasquero or a curandero as part of the Shipibo or shamanic tradition. Once you have that, you bring that back to the U.S. and you have to apply for what the DEA calls an exemption. And the exemption literally take years, sort of the same way that Sue Sisley has to go through this extra PHS policy review. There's no timeline on it. Many churches have been turned down for its approval, and many still practice. And this is sort of the gray area you get into with politics and policy, is churches are advised to apply for that exemption. But as far as I know, there's only been one church that has actually had their doors kicked in by the DEA, and that was the Santo Daime Church. So churches have two options to be approved to use ayahuasca as sacrament as part of their church ceremonies. The first is to just, basically ignore the DEA letters and recommendations to apply for the exemption, which means they continue practicing until the DEA kicks down their doors. That process would expedite the exemption process by going to the Supreme Court. Now, the other option is to comply with the DEA's request, which is a kind request, to say cease ceremonies and apply for an exemption before going into doing any more ceremonies. So that is the process of one church that I've been working with for the past year called Soul Quest Church of Mother Earth in Florida, ran by a guy named Chris Young, who has had all his practices based in Peru and holds medicine very well. I myself have sent vets down there to who have been diagnosed with treatment-resistant PTSD, who've had great success. And that was the first real church that I'd found in the United States that practices the way that vets need it to be, which is a Shipibo tradition based out of Peru, which I also found success in the Amazon when I took the vets down in 2014.
Okay, so real quick here. Bia is talking about the church. Why did they cancel the meeting with Soul Quest?
So the meeting with Soul Quest, prior to me involving them as a potential site, the DEA exemption I was not aware of until about a month and a half ago when Chris Young contacted me saying, hey, I received a letter from the DEA. I'm going to go ahead and shut down ayahuasca ceremonies and just do this through their methods and apply for this exemption. But prior to that, I had suggested using Chris as a potential site. Nothing's solidified. I didn't say I was going to use them.
You're just researching LZs right now, landing zones. You're just
absolutely, yeah, man. So I didn't have any success with Santo Daime, and I knew that the other church, the UDV, the Vegetal Church, which is also based out of Brazil, is very structured and closed-looped. That I felt like they wouldn't be open to it either. And Rick wasn't willing to shuffle out thousands of dollars to pay for these vets to go to Peru. So I was sort of stuck in between a rock and a hard place and said, well, fuck it, let's go with Soul Quest. Seeing as this is an observational study, these vets will be going down on their own accord. We will just be following them and collecting data. So after Bia's release of the article about ONAC and the practices that happened out in Washington State.
What's her objection to Soul Quest? Because I think that's going to get into what your letter you're talking about.
Right, gotcha. Well, Bia comes from a Santo Daime background, and this is my own speculation. It could be wrong, but
speculate away.
What's that?
Speculate away. I love speculation.
Gotcha, man. My gut, my intuition tells me that she is biased towards Santo Daime. After she shot down the idea for Soul Quest, I wasn't against that. I said, okay, well, they don't have an exemption. I get that MAPS doesn't want to be affiliated with someone who's not fully legal. Even though this is an observational study, I didn't feel it bared any legal ramifications against MAPS because we're following vets who are doing this on their own accord. It's not a controlled clinical trial where we're administering it using a church that could be operating under illegal pretenses. So after Bia shot that down, Rick was just kind of like, okay, well, what do we do now? Bia had brought in her own take, which was to use the LA division of Santo Daime, which is a church that she's very much involved with already. So we went that route. After about 2 months of waiting to hear back from Santo Daime, I had already told, Rick was already aware of our decision with Jonathan Goldman and Ashland, which is a different branch of the Santo Daime, that they were unwilling to change certain structures of the ceremony to fit the needs of vets, to make it more of a therapeutic context for vets. So I did not have any hope in the LA branch being willing to open up that as a potential site. But I waited. I didn't object. I wanted to get the damn study done at this point, and we had already gone through a lot of our military falling out with Bia, so I just sort of kept quiet on the sidelines and just watched the email traffic. And about a month and a half later, the LA branch got back to us and said, we don't have the capabilities of providing ceremony for veterans. And that was no surprise to me. But as soon as that feedback got back, that's when the suggestions from Bia to start kicking me off of the study started.
Okay. How do you know she suggested? Did she tell you she wanted to kick you off the study? Did you see this in writing? Did someone tell you?
Of course not. She did not tell me. Who would tell me?
How do you get the idea that she wanted to kick you off the study, and why would she kick you off the study, given this, you kind of started this whole thing, you've been working with MAPS for 3 years?
Right. That's kind of what took me by surprise with everything. I was on my way back from Florida, from visiting with family and doing ceremony with family, and I got a text from Jessica Nielsen who said, hey, you might want to know this, but Bia suggested kicking you off of the study. And so I became livid. She forwarded me the emails that I was not included in. At some point, Bia got me removed from the email chain. So I got this influx of emails that had been traveling back and forth, and got word that they had been holding Skype meetings without me. And so I chimed into the emails. I started up a new email thread, including all of the researchers that I added to the study, including Rick and Bia, and said, what the hell is going on? You guys are holding meetings without me. I'm a principal investigator of the study. I feel like I should be included in my own study. Why is Bia suggesting to kick me off of my own study?
When was the date? I have a question. Do you know in approximately what month? Was this in the last 4 weeks, month?
No, this is further out than a month. It was, I want to say this was like March or February. I have to do some digging on it.
No, that's interesting. Okay, I was just wondering. Okay, so at this point in time, seems to be a disconnect that Jessica and Rick, who you were involved with, and now Bia comes on via Rick's invitation, and you start to notice that all this work you have done to bring it to this point starts slipping through your hands, and you're not sure why.
You got it. I mean, honestly, completely baffled as to why. I got the fact that me and Bia had a falling out regarding military and. No,
that has nothing to do with your study. That has nothing to do with you as a researcher. That has to do about personal politics. I mean, I argue politics with my grandmother at Thanksgiving dinner.
Right. But that does, I mean, I was taking a research class at the time, and, a lot of what we were talking about was research bias, the researcher's bias, and why that plays into the political arena of research in general.
Well, no, I get it. Correct. Absolutely 100%. But you're talking about a researcher who has no problem being derogatory in private emails about you, another researcher. She has no problem stigmatizing you. And now, why, as an outside observer, can't I look at it and says, you were stigmatized, then marginalized? And that's what seems to have happened here. And that seems to be a story that's occurring over and over and over to veterans across this country. The stigma, and it's not just veterans. Any mental health issue is stigmatized. So when we were picture, because us veterans have been out there and you've spoken about your issues, I've spoken about the issues, our friends have spoken about the issues, there have been real consequences to speaking out and kind of leading the torch, right?
Right. Vulnerability.
Yeah. And what we have here is somebody who should know better in both Bia and Rick, to be very honest with you. I don't escape Rick from this at all. And let me read, and I think for intellectual honesty reasons, I have to read you Rick's response to me. I sent you the email I sent to Rick, and Rick's response to me saying, what the hell is this email? What's the story behind it? His response very simply was, yeah, Ryan has a mental illness. That was his response to Bia. So what you have is someone who didn't have a problem with your, quote, mental illness for 3 years, now saying, well, Bia's not wrong. Yet my response is neither of you are psychiatrists and psychologists, and you're telling me Bia and you didn't even talk. So how is she diagnosing you? How is Rick taking you seriously? This doesn't add up to me. This does not add up to me.
Wow.
Honestly, what's going on here is appropriation of your research, it seems like. And I'm bringing it up as a point. I'm not making the accusation, but you tell me why it's not. And I would love, because I know you've made that accusation, why not?
Well, I want to say what's coming up for me right now, dude. This is really healing to hear you say this, to have a third opinion about this. This has been very, very crushing to me as an individual and as a veteran. Thank you for name that bingo there just went off when you said Rick didn't have a problem working with me for 3 years, and then this comes in, and like Ricardo was saying, like there's this red flag that's being thrown up for convenience purposes. Thank you, man. That's really healing to hear you say that.
Well, I think, listen, when we look at this, right, there's aspects of intellectual property, and maybe there's no legal recourse for you because maybe it was general and the contract. There's no legal recourse. But to me, that's not an excuse, right? What is the morality? I mean, these people hold themselves out as these progressive people who judge other people, right?
Right.
Well, okay, let's judge your actions here. And the actions are, I don't care what the legal ramifications are. I don't care if there's no legal recourse for Ryan. That's not a defense to the moral responsibilities you had to Ryan, who, by the way, either he had no mental illness and you were fine, or you were fine with it, or he had a mental illness and you're working with him, so you owe him a responsibility of greater. You're using him, to be straight up. So yeah. Let's have a real discussion about this, because in one sense, it's not just about you, Ryan, right? This is something that's happening wide and far. When you have a mental illness, right, and you talk about it, you're screwed.
Yeah.
And unless you can talk about it, you can't heal from it.
Right.
And we see that in society when, I get so upset that, the discussion about gun violence, it's mental illness. Bull fucking shit. Bullshit. What we have here is the stigmatization and marginalization of mental illness. Now tell me, do you think PTSD is a DSM, but is it a mental illness?
I would say PTSD itself is a result of trauma and the inability for people to have resiliency in whatever capacity that is. If it's marginalization, stigmatization, underprivileged youth that grow up in broken homes and all of that, it seems to be like a war on kids who grew up in environments that weren't nurturing. And there's a disconnect between privilege and these populations.
Privilege is a great story. Let's talk about that. Carl Hart, who, by the way, when I discussed this with certain people, they just corrected my spelling of his last name instead of talking about the topic. Talks about this, and it talks about this research specifically, that he had a hard time coming from the inner city. Carl Hart's the first African-American neuroscientist at Columbia, or in the Ivy Leagues. I believe he's tenured professor at the Ivy Leagues or at Columbia. He's a neuroscientist, brilliant guy, and he really has a different take on addiction and really groundbreaking research he's doing. But he talks about when he entered research in academia, he had a real problem coming from a non-privileged background where they deal in direct fashion. And what we see here in academia, which is what we see with Bia, which is passive aggressive. They work on the outside and you don't even know the knife's going in your back.
Right.
And so
ethically they can get away with it. I mean, legally they can get away with it, but ethically, yeah, dude, it's a fucking horrible, nasty thing to do to people who come from underprivileged backgrounds, who like minorities also as well, and people of color suffer from the same bullshit that I feel veterans are inflicted on, which is this hey, let's pull out the card to say that these people are unwilling to be responsive to treatment, and that's bullshit. And people like Carl Hart have to fight tooth and nail to make it.
Well, forget it. Let's not even talk about the patient. Let's not even talk about that person. We're talking about the researcher. We're talking about Ryan LeCompte, the researcher, not the patient. We're talking about Ryan LeCompte as a veteran, which is 7% of the population, and absolutely is a minority, especially if you talk about how they're being treated with the suicide epidemic, the overdose epidemic, how we're being treated, in terms of being abused, that the volunteer army is not a volunteer army. It's a socioeconomic draft. Let's get real. So what we're doing is preying on the poor and the underprivileged for the benefit of the privileged. It's no different than college deferments because you don't have to join. And if you got a scholarship to USC or daddy's paying it, you don't join. And then what ends up happening when you come back sick or disabled through this, they shut you out, they stigmatize and marginalize because they for the jobs. And so when we look at this from the perspective of the bigger picture, this isn't just about veterans, as you said. This is about all mental illness. But it's also about minorities in general and how they're treated in the society, because what you have here is Bia, an anthropologist acting like a psychiatrist or psychologist. Rick, obviously, at what point does Rick cut you out officially? Or what point do you step down? And how does that conversation go with Rick, who you've worked for 3.5 years and obviously was happy with you until Bia shows up on the scene, it seems like.
Right. Yeah, man, it seems like, I've been trying to wrap my head around it, and just talking with you right now has made so much more clear to me. Going through Naropa has been a struggle. It seems like this is a reoccurring thing. Every time I come out as a veteran, I wear a Marine veteran cap when I go to my internship site at Naropa. Like right now, I'm having a falling out with my supervisor who sees me in a certain light, and is unwilling to go there with me in certain aspects of who I am as a vet, knows little about my background, working with ayahuasca, working as a practitioner, and frankly doesn't care. So now I'm in a situation at Naropa right now where I have to go before the chair of the transpersonal department and explain my situation, being the only veteran at Naropa. And that's part of this battling uphill thing that feels like it's fucking hopeless, to get these people who live in Boulder, who live and breathe Boulder, which is a very, very rich, privileged, white city. And guess what? I'm the bad guy. And if I speak up, or if I say what my 2 cents is, and I've been vulnerable in the past, guess what? They're going to bring that up. They're going to use that and say you're unfit to be a counselor. That's what my fear is. I can't even become a professional in my field as a wounded healer to deliver the right kind of therapy to people that are struggling. And as far as my rapport with my clients, that's a different story, dude.
Let me interrupt you. Okay. I disagree with you. Take my situation. I mean, obviously it's well publicized what I'm doing now and what I've done in the past, and some organizations of government entities haven't been too happy with me. You're going to continue to do this regardless of what the bureaucrats say, regardless of what the bow tie and suit and tie guys say, because your experience as a Marine, your experience at a level that none of these people have, they hold the power strings, but you have the power. You have the power to make a difference. So I want you to know that don't give up. Don't feel, you're alone, because we've got the masses. I mean, I can tell you, just when I started with Sue and Ricardo with the Facebook Vets for Dr. Sue Sisley, from day one, we got stories from veterans and non-veterans who use cannabis in lieu of pharmaceuticals, and talk about how it's made a difference. And their story mimicked my story and mimicked the story after that. I don't know if we're the tail ends of the bell curve, so they don't give a shit about us. But what I tell you is we've got the power and we've got the masses. So we're going to highlight this story, and I want you to know that it's important for me to get this story out here. And I want to curtail, because we do have to end it here, and I want to follow up with you.
From the moment Bia suggested kicking me off of the study to right now has been little to no correspondence. When I first asked them about dropping me, I didn't get a response. Cut off exactly is the word that I would use. Cut off in a very passive, kind of sneakily way, and then waiting for me to sort of blow up, and eventually got the intel from you, thank God, that about 2 weeks later, after radio silence, was stigmatized as having a mental illness. And from that, I guess I'll just share a conversation. This is the last piece of conversation that I had with Rick Doblin over text message. And I want to share that so that everyone out there knows my relationship with MAPS at this point.
Sure.
Rick, there was no clear or honest communication. I was a principal investigator of this study with full sponsorship and support from MAPS, and the next I was cut from the email chain and told, hey, yeah, we decided to go in a different direction. We will advise you if you need it. That's horse shit, Rick, and you know it. That's what we're calling genuine grievances with MAPS, mental illness. I have been working with your organization for years, and you conveniently diagnose me after a specific situation comes up. You guys are licensed to diagnose. You say mental illness as if it's a bad thing. Your mental health is a white upper-class Harvard bubble privilege. And he said, you said yourself you were suffering from PTSD. There is no stigma to that. I said, we all have trauma of some kind, Rick. If you deny that about yourself, you're a liar. There is stigma because you're using that as grounds to diminish my capabilities as a researcher. And then I said, I share in that you have secondary trauma by secondhand. Okay, here's what he said. I have my share of trauma and have spoken often about how I was traumatized secondhand by the Holocaust, and that's one of the primary drivers for my work. We are not trying to diminish you as a researcher. I share in that I am an Ashkenazi Jew. Then why throw the mental illness around? You've made that offer several times. Why would I consult you after you have fallen back on your offer to sponsor my study and then move to a separate one with other researchers that I brought onto mine? There's no way I would divulge data or consider collaborating with you after all of this. And this is where he says, you are making too big of a deal about mental illness. All we said was you said about having PTSD. We're not working on an observational study since there's a lot more going on. I put too big of a deal. You're inferring or implying something by making that statement. I'm not blind, Rick, and neither are other veterans. It's condescending and degrading to bring it up in light of the circumstances. No transparency from any of you. I've tried for months to work together, but I didn't get that. It's dishonest, as covert as you make it to be. I and many others are aware of the subversiveness of it all. And he said, I'm not trying to be subversive or condescending. I apologize if I gave you reason to think that of me. And the last piece I put was, I forgive you, but I can't forget. There is an exposed population out there who haven't found healthy coping abilities or were never privileged enough to have been given ways to as you have. And what concerns me is if I am treated this way, how many other veterans would be under your care? I am representing them, both as a researcher and as a veteran. The trauma cannot be bypassed for the sake of making drugs legal, Rick. I'm sorry all this didn't work out. I have to look after my tribe of warriors who gave everything for my privilege to be here texting. And then he said, I appreciate your advocacy for all veterans. And then the last text I sent was, we all should be for vets, Doc. Veterans are what got all of your Jewish brothers and sisters out of the fire in the Holocaust to begin with. You owe them your honor.
There's no doubt you got pushed out. That's just factual. You got pushed out. Why you got pushed out, to me, even if I take Rick at face value, I call bullshit. You don't work for someone for 3.5 years and then suddenly cut them out because they have a mental illness. And then when emails emerge of Bia being the instigator behind that, it raises some ethical and moral questions that I think Rick has to answer. And I'm going to give Rick a chance, if he wants to do an interview or write something. But it sure seems to me that, listen, Rick traded up. He traded up with two people that have, a little bit more experience. Maybe Jessica has a lot more experience than you. And Bia coming in gives him access to doing it. And that makes me sad. And it makes me sad because it may not be, you may have no legal repercussions, but I have to raise a serious moral and ethical question. And did MAPS violate, some ethical and moral responsibility to you? And I think that I would say yes right now. And I think we have to be fair and give Rick a decision, a chance to respond, and Bia a chance to respond. And I welcome both of them to come on. I'd love Bia to come on to discuss all her hatred towards U.S. foreign policy, given I was in Central and South America. I'd be happy to talk to her. She's probably wrong about a lot of it, to be honest with you. We were down there to advance corporate interest and so forth, and I think we did do a lot of damage. So bottom line is brother, I love you, and we're going to give you a chance, and I think we need people who have a higher calling in this, who do it for the right reasons. And people like Jessica who seem to me to be in it for the right reasons. I hope she continues and does wonderful things. And MAPS does wonderful things, but I want to help you get your study done. And so let's bring you back on in a couple weeks. I'd like to talk about what you're doing post this with your study and how we can help you get that accomplished, because I'm sure it's going to take some fundraising.
I appreciate that, Sean. I love you too, man. Thanks for having me on, dude.
We hope you guys enjoyed the first episode of Weed for Warriors Project podcast with Sean Kiernan. Stay tuned for more.